Welcome to Friday Faces. I'm very excited to introduce you to our very first guest, Anjan Shah. Anjan is a saxophone player with a very impressive career. He's a saxophonist, he's also a composer, he does a lot of improvisation, right?
Improvisation, yeah.
You can look up his bio online and on social media. He's also a writer, and we'll talk about that later. So, welcome to Friday Faces, Anjan.
So nice to be here. Thank you, Anna. I appreciate the interest, and it seems like a timely project to get people thinking about their careers, and looking at different um, how different people have kind of pieced together an existence within the music field. So I appreciate being here and allowing you to share some thoughts.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Yes, you said we're gonna be talking about careers, choices, the present and the future of the music field. I would like to start knowing, I know a little bit about how you started, but I want to hear from you, like, when did this all start? When did you decide to pursue a career in music?
I don't think there was ever, or I ever had a single moment. It was always there, but the decision to pursue it seriously came when I realized music wasn't just something I enjoyed. It was how I connected with people. College felt like an official path, but looking back, I was following instinct more than strategy.
Okay, nice. I think I relate to that. I think, especially as young musicians, we probably go more from instinct than anything else, right? You decided to go to college for a career, for a degree in music. Was that performance or?
Yeah, that was performance. I started at Michigan State, and from there, I was fortunate in high school. I studied with saxophone. One of the preeminent teachers of the saxophone, at least American School of Playing, a gentleman by the name of Larry Teal. And I started with him in high school, and he guided me to study with Jim Forger at Michigan State. And so I did my bachelor's there. And then I had an opportunity to work on my master's with Joe Luloff at the University of Illinois. And I started my master's work with Joe and pretty much finished everything except one semester back in 1990. And then opportunity showed up faster than getting the degree. I had a chance to do some real world performance with the U.S. Army Field Band in Washington, D.C. And it felt like the learning there was going to be much more intense, much more in real time. And on top of that, having being able to make a living playing saxophone. So I chose that experience over finishing my master's program. And, I never looked back until, kind of this past year when I came back to Illinois in September of 2025 to finish that last semester.
Hmm? That's impressive. Yeah, I've seen you on campus.
Yeah.
So you went to Washington, D.C. Can you tell me again the group?
Sure. It was the U.S. Army Field Band of
Army
Washington,
Field.
D.C.
Okay,
Yeah.
Army Field.
And it was the concert band I played in.
I suppose that's around that time when you started the Capitol Quartet, right? I know you're a co-founder.
Yeah. When I landed in DC, a couple of classmates of mine, one from University of Illinois, also landed in Washington, DC, and then one person from Michigan State also landed in Washington, DC. They were with the Marine Band. And so we just, our daily schedule was essentially from 9 to 1 p.m. every day. And the rest of the day was left free for practicing or for doing things that we needed to do, maybe teaching, stuff like that. But so we formed the Capitol Quartet at that time and started, learning a bunch of repertoire and started performing in the Baltimore, Washington, Northern Virginia area on different recital series. And, over time that kind of grew from not only doing recitals to doing orchestral programs, working with the Philip Glass Concerto with Marin Alsop and performing that with orchestras, as well as having a pretty significant pops program and working with conductors like Marvin Hamlish, Jeff Tyzik, Jack Everly, and playing with orchestras up in Canada, in the US, as well as in South America.
Wow, many places. I've also heard, I've listened to some of the recordings. The one that mixes Bach with jazz is like
Oh,
fun.
yeah. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of
I
fun.
love that one. As a
Yeah.
pianist, I tell you that was fun.
And it was very reflective of our upbringing. When I say our, the group's upbringing, each of the individual, I think as saxophonist, one of the things that, and I'm going to generalize here, maybe your listeners will disagree, but at least from my experiences, one of the things that academic saxophone programs, oftentimes they get so focused on the classical repertoire that the individual who's doing the learning does not really have adequate time to learn contemporary or jazz stylings, and as a result, are at a disadvantage when they get out of college. The flip side of that is programs that have very strong jazz programs, they don't learn have as strong of a grounding in classical, and so they may need to work on some classical skills outside. But I found, at least in my experiences, and I think the Capitol Quartet is an example, at least at the time that I was really involved with it, is an example of the importance of being able to cross different genres in a very convincing and compelling way. And I think that I didn't necessarily get that from music school. I got that more from the military band that I played in, because we played so many different styles of music that we had to be fluent in many contemporary styles, as well as the traditional Sousa band type styles. When I was with the Marine Band, when I was with the Army Field Band, I was fortunate enough to be a tour soloist, and I got to play the Iberic Concerto about 167 times during my 5 years there, and which is pretty significant, in terms of working on stage presence, working on consistency, being able to produce night after night. And so that was some great experience. But, the flip side of that was that, the second half of the program, inevitably I would have to do something that was jazz related, either improvise 8 measures if we're playing an arrangement of, a Glenn Miller medley or something like that. So the importance of that, being able to play a variety of different styles, we incorporated that into the Capitol Quartet and made that a pops program. And we were very fortunate when we rolled this all out in the early 2000s to be able to play with the Cincinnati Pops, with the Rochester Philharmonic, with the Baltimore Symphony, orchestra up in Canada, the Ottawa National Center Orchestra, playing with the Guatemala Symphony, playing with the Long Beach Symphony, Indianapolis Symphony, playing just, we're very fortunate just because we had the flexibility of style, and each of the players could very naturally execute on style changes at a change of the piece very quickly.
So in your case, that what you're saying, being able to play and be comfortable in different genres, really played a role in having a career with that ensemble, with the quartet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I see a lot of saxophone quartets out there right now. And, it's wonderful to see all of those quartets. But I think the bigger opportunity, and again, this is my opinion, so many of those quartets, saxophone choirs, they focus on kind of replaying stuff that is already there. In other words, the music becomes a little derivative. And it's great seeing the level of musicianship. But my opinion, again, there's not a lot of creativity into the programming that I see going into it. And that's determined more by the types of venues that these quartets are getting booked at. It's very easy to play for schools of music, colleges, and doing very academically challenging repertoire. I think it's much more difficult to be able to put a program together for an audience that knows absolutely nothing about saxophone and is there for perhaps an evening of maybe entertainment and maybe some education with that.
That makes sense. I agree. I
Yeah.
actually agree. And I think, from my perspective as a pianist, I think the saxophone world in comparison is doing great, because I think we're even more stuck. For us, it's even harder to find, especially young musicians that cross over different genres, because our repertoire is so massive, and sometimes, especially for instance, competitions, or like you're saying, the academia, the degree requirements and everything, it really makes us kind of staying just with this line, and we all go to concerts and play concerts, and the repertoire is really repetitive, like you were saying. And of course, there's things, people that are playing contemporary music, new stuff, or pieces that are crossover from different genres, but it's hard to find that.
Yeah, it is. And I think, we rely so much on our teachers to provide the type of artistic direction. And I think, this is one of the things that I cover in one of the articles that I wrote. I think that, when faculty members get a college teaching job and they become tenured, oftentimes there's very little incentive to really introduce compelling new or contrary ideas. In other words, the trajectory is pretty much set at that point, that this is the type of style that I'll be teaching. These are the types of students that I'm going to be attracting. This is the type of curriculum that's going to be involved. And oftentimes, again, I'm generalizing, oftentimes it's not in relationship to the market. It's in relationship to how they were brought up, and kind of perpetuating that mindset of teaching. So that's kind of where I talk about, the whole idea. And this is kind of a negative view. Your viewers will probably disagree with it, but I think this is kind of the whole idea of the Ponzi scheme, where it kind of goes back, because it just perpetuates itself to a certain degree.
Tell me one more time what the Ponzi scheme is.
Yeah, sure. The Ponzi scheme is paying into an idea that you're going to become better or richer, in the case of Ponzi, by having one person help make all the decisions. In the case of Ponzi, financial. In the case of what we're doing here in music academia, relying on that one professor to make all your artistic, fundamental, foundational artistic values, setting those values in place. And where that runs into problems is that in the Ponzi example, a person's taking your money. The expectation that you have for giving that person money is that they're going to make you more money, right? The expectation that we have studying with specific teachers is that it's going to help open up the doors for potential job opportunities, right? But what has happened in both is, in the case of Ponzi, they keep taking money, but they don't pay a return. For us, we keep studying with these teachers and, hoping and praying for a job when we graduate. And, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's so many talented musicians out there with masters and DMAs that are no longer in the music field, just because, they were not given the perspective of what the larger industry is looking for. They were pigeonholed into, one very narrow segment of the music field. In the case of classical saxophone, playing classical saxophone, either saxophone quartets, saxophone classical repertoire, or playing in concert bands. And aside from the military, there's no professional concert bands in the US. There's a lot of community bands. And I know several very talented players that have DMAs that play in community bands, but, work day jobs as lawyers or doctors or computer programmers,
Mm-hmm.
and they found their success there, but it's just, kind of thinking, what the motivation for us to get involved with music, whether it's in, grade school, high school, college, decide to get a degree in music, is that, at some point there was a compelling and passionate reason for wanting to be in this field and making the determination to get a degree in it, thinking that you're going to have an entire career, 40, 50, 60 years in this field. And, it's a little bit of an awakening when you realize that, there's no jobs there.
Yeah, it is. Let me ask you, so you talked about how you went to Washington, D.C. because you thought it would be such an intensive learning process. And you talked about what you were missing from academia back then when you were pursuing a degree in music. What would you say was the role, what do you think was the role your degree played in preparing you for the career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my degree prepared me to be a better musician, not necessarily a better professional, but definitely a better musician. It gave me the discipline and foundation, but it really didn't prepare me for how to build a career, how to find work, and how to connect with audiences. In academia, we're always focused on trying to bring artistic statement to the music with absolutely, very little regard to the audience. I'm generalizing. There are some folks that talk about the audience as part of the entire experience, but, mostly the focus is on skill acquisition, in developing that, and the type of repertoire that, your teacher encourages you to play is for the development of skill acquisition. Oftentimes it's not necessarily programmatic to help with audience development or, being able to tell a broader story through your music.
If I may ask, especially as someone who has never taken a break from school, I went from my undergrad to my master's, now to my DMA. I imagine it could be quite difficult to come back after leaving, and especially after already having such a successful career. What made you decide to come back and finish your master's?
This was kind of a personal thing for me. After my father had passed away, I started reflecting on what I hadn't finished. The week before he passed, he and I were briefly talking, and he was talking about the importance of looking back on your life and being able to say that you did this, you did that, you've got a beautiful family, you were able to send your kids to college, you were able to do all of these things. He goes, don't ever look back and feel like you didn't finish something that you started. And so that kind of stuck with me, and not only academically, but artistically. And then coming back wasn't about the credential. It was more about clarity and kind of reconnecting with why I do this.
Wow, that's really powerful. What would you say were the most difficult challenges of coming back?
Coming back, I think balancing real life with being a student was tough. But honestly, the bigger challenge was this shifting perspective, going from being a professional back into a system that doesn't always reflect how the industry actually works. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. How different did academia feel from when you were a part of it, like back in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
To now? Is it different? What things?
Yeah. In some ways, it didn't feel that different. And I think that's part of the issue. The industry has changed so dramatically with the internet, has so dramatically changed just recently with streaming services, with Apple Music, with Spotify, now layering in AI and how that's changed not only the business side of how companies do business, but now we're starting to see it in film. We're starting to see it where it relates to us is in musical composition. And academia just hasn't evolved at the same pace. So there's still a heavy focus on traditional paths that, in my opinion, just no longer exist in the way that they did before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. This is very interesting to hear you and your perspective. And especially because as I said earlier today, I already know some of these thoughts because I read your posts on social media. And I really wanted to delve into that because, I don't think we hear this perspective that often, because I feel like, at least my opinion, when you go to college and then you go through the degrees, and as you said, you're trying to build your skills and you're focused on that, I don't think professors tell you much about, it's not like a negative way of thinking about reality. It's like the reality is that, like, you need to think about what you're gonna do next, where you're going, and what jobs you can find after, or what creative projects you could do. What do you want to do, right? We don't talk about this that much. So I wanted to ask you, what strengths, before we get into that, what strengths do you see in the system?
I think the foundation is strong. The level of musical training, the discipline, the ensemble experience is incredible. The issue isn't the foundation, it's how we translate that into real world careers, right? And so I think there's an opportunity to start introducing real world scenarios at the undergraduate, graduate, and especially at the DMA level. Maybe more so at the master's level. DMA, you're solely focused on, a very narrow segment of interest. But definitely at the master's level to start, thinking about how all of this translates into real world careers. So I think that, to your point, the foundation is strong, the level of musical training, the discipline, the ensemble experience, that's fantastic. But I think, administrators, um, people at the college and the university level, the board of regents, they need to start thinking about, is this what is going to help the student the most? And I look at, you've read my article, so I thank you for that. I look at like the engineering college, I look at the business school, and just look at how they think about the careers and the training in engineering and in business. There are much clearer pathways into whether it's the world of engineering or the world of business, and what that hierarchy looks like. In engineering, there's a bunch of different certifications that you have to get depending on the type of engineer that you're going to be. On the business side, you can specialize in accounting, operations, finance, marketing, sales. And so there are definite pathways there. For us, the criteria tends to be, put a program together to do a recital. Maybe there's a paper involved, but there's no application to how do you take that work and apply it into a real world scenario.
Oh, because you also have a master's in business, is that correct?
Yeah, an MBA. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But I think that came as a result of coming to the realization that the music degree is not going to get me what I need to have to provide for my family.
What do you think are what are the skills that a young professional nowadays would need, according to you, besides obviously being great at playing their instruments and all that stuff? What skills do you think are very important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important call out. There's so many great players out there. But, the one thing, and you're aware of this, musicians aren't great communicators. They're great at being in the practice room, but oftentimes, and I'm generalizing, I've found that they lack the social skills to be able to effectively network. And networking is a critical skill that I think, musicians have to learn how to develop. We, in a college environment, academic environment, there's an implied adversarial, especially within specific studios, there's an implied adversarial relationship that you have with your peers, because they're working on some repertoire, you're trying to be better than them. In some ways, it's good because it motivates you to practice more, right? But over time, it builds this natural bias towards other people. I mean, I see it in the saxophone world. There's, the Eastman School of Playing, there's the Illinois School of Playing, there's the Michigan School of Playing, and all of these, in the overall scheme of things, we're just trying to communicate as artists, but that creates barriers to networking. And so we only tend to gravitate towards people who think like us. Mm-hmm. And it's more important to try to expand your network to people who don't think like us, mm-hmm. because there's where the opportunity is. They may be looking for a different perspective, and so I think, to your broad question, what are the skills? I think, communication skills, socialization skills, networking skills. That kind of falls into one category. Being able to write um, and to communicate what a piece of music feels and why you're programming it, why it's important to you, to be able to, tell somebody who knows absolutely nothing about music, what insights are they going to gain? And I'm not talking about a theoretical insight. They really don't care, about sonata form and the exposition going through a chromatic, 251. They don't care about that. They want to understand what the social impact or the emotional impact of the piece would be. And so we have to be able to communicate that as artists, to relate it to real people in real situations. So I think that's another aspect. One thing that's never covered is financial discipline, right? We end up, artists, if it wasn't for my wife, I tell you, I would be broke. All right. And at no point did we ever talk about financial discipline as an artist, right? It's like we do whatever we need to do for the sake of the art. And even if that means sacrificing, things that we direly need, we do that. So I think that, understanding financial discipline, understanding how to create like a recording budget, for instance, or how to create a budget to put on an event or a recital. And I'm not talking about doing free recitals. I'm doing about how to get paid for recitals, right? Negotiation, right? I mean, when we're young, we're also eager to play. We oftentimes play for free. Oh yeah, come play on this church series. We'll pass the basket around, and you'll make some things like that. Or at a jazz club, we'll pay for tips. Or oftentimes club owners will say, well, we'll give the band dinner in one drink. Yeah, it's like, okay, that's not going to pay bills, right? So being able to negotiate, so things like that, like common sense type stuff, skills that I think need to be, and we have to talk about that because, as administrators, the other disciplines cover this. If you're in nursing school, what your trajectory is going to look like. Where the nursing shortages are. What the market rates are for nurses. Same thing for architects, same thing for engineers, same thing for doctors, same thing for, not so much for musicians. If you're going to be in academia, if you're going to teach and this kind of goes back to the Ponzi scheme, the only viable place is teaching others to do what you do. So yeah, that's, where I see kind of where we need to develop skills.
Thank you so much. This is so much of like helpful advice for all of us, and I can't wait to share it with everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity again.